This DVD continues from a previous volume. If you haven't watched the previous volumes, it's highly recommended that you do so first. Panning and tracking handoffs are almost identical moves and are often interchangeable. However, the tracking handoff can be considered the enhanced version. As we do tracking versions of some of the handoffs from the panning chapter, we track with the characters, ending on a sign. Here we hand off from one character to another. Since we're not handing off by panning, but instead by moving the entire dolly, we're physically moving to a new area and have a much easier time separating the characters and keeping a good angle. Here we're using a switch to do a document handover as we track through the scene, moving with the red man, switching to the woman, and switching to the blue man. If we did this with a pan, our angle on the characters would get worse and worse, but on track we're able to continuously keep a good angle. Tracking handoffs also produce a great deal of parallax. Here we track with a waiter. As we hand off to the guests, we get very pronounced parallax, which a lock camera could never produce. Or if we're starting parked on the restaurant guests, we pick up on the waiter, walk with them, then end on a character in the foreground, again creating heavy parallax and a quick and surprising reveal. The great thing about tracking handoffs is that with minor consideration they can come by as an almost automatic consequence of tracking between keyframes. In this scene, one of the things that happen is that the man walks over here. We'll presumably have many different keyframes in the scene, but the two we would be interested in are a shot on the man and a shot on the woman. If these keyframes are connected for tracking with his walk, we get an automatic handoff as we end in the second keyframe. This creates very three-dimensional blocking and is very easy to do. Starting in the man's shot, we pull with him as he walks, handing off to the woman. Since both keyframes would probably be needed for cutting dialogue before the actual move, we would likely also shoot a locked version staying on the woman as well. Another very everyday use for a tracking handoff comes as a byproduct of not having enough track or wanting to avoid the edge of the set. In this shot, we're restricted by needing to keep the studio lamp out of the shot as well as the length of the track. So we simply pick up on him as soon as he steps into the shot. When we reach the end of the track, we stop and let him walk out of the shot. So we're effectively handing off from the set to the character or vice versa, which creates the same kind of attention shift as any handoff. He steps in. We track with him. And just before we go over the edge of the track, we stop and let him walk out of the shot. This move comes from a technical restriction, but it looks so good that we ought to do it on purpose. And the way to do that is simply to start or stop short of character movement. In this shot from a previous chapter, we're tracking with the characters through a park as they talk. Instead of just cutting to another scene when they're done, we'll stop the track and let them walk out of the shot, effectively handing off to the scenery. In this shot, we're really just supposed to track with the man from point A to point B, but we'll instead pretend that we're restricted and park on the woman. So we don't begin tracking with the man until he passes this point, again creating an attention shift that makes the shot just a little more interesting. Opening and closing space is an effective technique for accommodating character movement. In the most basic version, as the woman walks to the table, we'll pull back to open up the shot so we can cover her move. When she walks back to the man, we again push in to tighten the shot. We're calling this opening and closing space because one of the best uses is to make room for characters as they enter and exit shots. Here we're on the man. We open the space to make room for the woman entering. And when she leaves, we close the space again. Looking at it from above, we're getting the camera out of the way to make room for her. When she leaves, we close the gap again. This is useful for several things. Opening space is helpful, as we just saw, to bring more characters in. Here we're having dialogue between the two women and the man. When he walks over to them, we widen their shot to make room, and then add a reverse 3 shot to match. Closing the space when a character leaves gives us a reason to push in on the remaining character. If we think about it, anytime a character walks away, it makes sense to identify with the remaining character. So as the red woman walks to a different mark, closing the space does double duty. Another use for closing space is to simply tighten a shot at a certain point in a scene. As the woman sits down, we push in, ready for the next part of the dialogue. This move is so simple, it's easy to overlook. We pan with the woman over to the table. As she sits down, we push in and tighten the atmosphere. An interesting move is to start a scene by opening the space and then have the characters fill the frame. We start on the blue man. As we pull out, the red man and the woman step into the frame. In this variation, we'll have the surrounding characters flood the frame. We pull out. The red man stands up, and as he walks to the woman, the surrounding extras spill into the frame. In this example, we start on the characters and then pull out slowly as they talk. What we're doing is making room for the blue man as he secretly steps in, certainly a meaningful character in the story. A less overt way of opening and closing space is to offset the dolly based on one character's movement. As the man walks away, we close the space. And as he walks back to her, we open the space. This technique is subtle but extremely useful. We can go back and forth any number of times and cover the entire scene this way. Shooting in tight spaces, it's very effective to place the camera in the path of moving characters and then move it to the side to make room for them. We start in the middle of their path. As the characters come closer, we move out of their way. In this example, the characters pass by, but the move is just as useful if they move in and stop. Let's put together a quick scene where we open and close space to assist character movement. As the woman moves to a new position, we open the space. The red man leaves the scene, and we open the space to cover his movement. He leaves, and we close the space to identify with the remaining characters. In the next two chapters, we'll look at the effect of the track angle on a character. There are two distinctly different ways to look at this, the first of which is that the angle determines how personal a move is. With the track angle directly on the character, we're essentially moving along her eye line, making us emotionally involved with her. So when we move in, we're becoming more identified with her and feel what she's feeling. When we're pulling out, we're detaching from her. Both moves are about her, so we'll call this a personal angle. Here the blue man leaves, and we push in on the red man. The track is directly angled at him, so it's a completely personal move. When we lay the track side to side, we more or less maintain the distance to the character, making the shot impersonal. This creates a more disconnected or indifferent feeling. So it doesn't mean that the move is without emotion, but simply that we're keeping our distance. Here the red man is in the hospital waiting to hear if his wife will survive. In this scene, staying at a distance is the best way to show how alone and helpless he is. If we angle the track anywhere between personal and impersonal, we get a move that is a mixture of both. So if we're in a situation where the character's in trouble because of her own doing, we might be pushing in because the shot is about her, but we're also being impersonal because she's on her own. The more we angle the track on the character, the more we connect with her. This move is more personal, but still slightly detached. The closer we're moving along the eye line of a character, the more we connect with her, which is a sliding scale that can be adjusted for the situation. But another consequence of the track angle is the amount of parallax. When we're keeping the character in a fixed position in the frame, we get the parallax from the passing background instead of the passing foreground. We'll call this back parallax. If we first push directly in on the man, we get virtually no parallax. But if we angle the track even just a little bit, we get parallax from the moving background. This has the very particular effect of making a character's world seem unrestful. Let's angle the track even more and say that the red man is being told that his fraud scheme has been discovered and he could go to prison. As we push, his world seems suddenly torn up. What we're seeing is the background passing by, but it's as if we can see his troubled thoughts. We're calling this phenomenon unrest, which is a powerful and accurate way to look at it. As we push directly in on the dialogue, the scene is completely calm except for the heightened focus we get from tracking. The more we angle the track, the more unrest we add to their world. Usually we'll want to angle all personal tracks a little bit. Here the slight angle causes a small amount of unrest in the background, which elevates the push. Unrest is again a sliding scale, so if we angle the track a lot, we go beyond unrestful to hectic. In this reference move, we're pushing directly in on the man. The lack of parallax makes it look almost like a zoom. Here we've angled the track so we get very heavy back parallax, especially at the end, which makes the scene very hectic. The effect is amplified with a longer focal length. Here we're doing an angled push with a regular lens. But with a longer lens, keeping him fixed in the frame causes very pronounced movement in the background. Back parallax or unrest is an integral part of many of the moves we'll look at in the next chapters, so we'll keep working with it as we make choices about how to angle tracks. Regrouping is a very effective way of directing our attention during a shot. It comes in 3 variations, including as we add more characters to the shot, isolating as we single out characters, and shifting as we select a different section of the scene. A typical way of including is as a start-on reveal. As the red woman talks, we slowly add the other character to the scene. As the red man has lines, we regroup to include him. With isolating, we again have a motivation for pushing. As the dialogue centers around the women, we slowly single them out. If the over-the-shoulder is our starting point, we'll slowly single out the red woman. Shifting works the same way as a panning regroup, but gives us more freedom. As the blue man turns to the woman, we pull back to focus on their dialogue. As he turns back to the red man, we again use him as the common denominator. When the red man leaves, we again offset the shot back to the dialogue with the woman. The move works on its own, but a better time to use it is when the characters in the scene are also regrouping. As in the chapter on panning regroups, it first of all comes naturally to regroup on the remaining characters when a character leaves. As the blue man walks out, we regroup to the couple. The move amplifies the effect of what is already happening. Characters isolating themselves is again amplified with a regroup. Here we single out the women at the same time as they isolate themselves, bringing more emphasis to that action. Here the red man turns and takes a step towards us as we single him out. We could do this with either a character or a camera movement, but by doing both, our intention becomes much clearer. A very expressive way to regroup is to mix it with unrest by angling the track. If we have 2 characters sitting at a control panel, we'll first isolate the blue man with the track angled directly at him. But if we angle the track, we make their world seem unrestful. When we regroup now, the situation is much more dramatic. Pulling out from the blue man, we're including the red man in the shot. But if we instead angle the track, the world seems much more hectic. With a tracking reframe, we nudge the camera to accommodate character movement. As the man walks to the left, if we don't do anything, the framing becomes slightly odd. So we'll put the camera on a track and adjust the framing as he moves. As he moves between points on the set, we nudge the dolly a little to the side. As he walks back, we nudge the other way. Similar to how we used a panning reframe to adjust the framing as characters moved in and out, a tracking reframe is all about adjusting our position to keep a balanced shot. We wouldn't have been able to cover this movement with a pan, at least not as well. As the men walk to the woman, we reframe to get the best framing for both extremes. Reframing by tracking instead of panning gives us more control and a motivated camera move. Reframing is very effective for creating a master that stays useful throughout the scene. Here we have one wide master on a track and a few closer cameras for coverage. As the blue man walks over to the desk, we reposition the master slightly to maintain a good framing. We're only using the master when it's moving. Here we're starting in closer coverage between two lock cameras. While the red man talks, we cut to the master to cover the blue man walking away. In the second keyframe, we've added one more lock camera for dialogue. As he walks over to the woman, we again cover his move in the reframing master. This is called an occasional master because we cut to it for specific moves, something we'll look at more in the next chapter. A timed master move is repositioning a master at specific times during a scene. There are two basic ways to do this, the occasional master and the continuous master. Starting with the occasional master, in this scene the red man walks over to a control panel and back again. We're using the master as a backbone, and we've timed the dolly to follow him. At each mark we've set up a pair of reverses as well. However, with the occasional master, we're only interested in cutting to the master for the actual move. Here we're cutting dialogue between the first reverse pair. As he walks, we go to the master and follow him to the second mark, where we cut between the second reverse pair. When he walks back, we again go to the master, just for the move. This technique is an extremely easy way to get motivated movement at just the right time using a minimum number of cameras. Here we've designed the master to only move during major stage business. We've set several stops along the way and will only be in the master for the actual moves. First, we walk with the characters into the scene. They stop and we go to two reverse cameras for dialogue. As they sit down, we go back in the master and do a time push to coincide with their movement. Between moves, we leave the master running in case we want to cut wide. We go back into the master as one character leaves, and use the remaining dolly track for a push. We've now been back in the master 3 times, each time to cover major stage business. Even though the master is occasional, it's the silver lining that binds the scene together. With a continuous master, the master's our main coverage. We time the track to start at an important beat in the script. For this to work, it's important that we've been in the master for a while prior to the move so that we notice it beginning to move. Here we watch the characters through a window as they discuss a strange issue. Suddenly, some startling information comes up on the computer screen. As they talk, we track to a different angle. Timing the move to an important development brings elevated focus to a certain part of the scene. That's reason enough to do it, however, it's even better to end somewhere useful. For instance, ready for a new dialogue. Here we're again in a parked master. The conversation is progressing normally until the red man suddenly begins to reveal some sensitive information. It's the fact that we see the beginning of the move that makes the Time Master move work. As we slowly reposition, we give extra attention and importance to what he says. Again, we make sure to end somewhere useful, here and over the shoulder. It's very effective to open or even completely cover a scene by doing a slow master push. As the characters go about their business, we float into the scene. The move adds a level of drama and is extremely easy to block because the characters can move freely and even improvise without affecting the camera move. But since we're shooting in the direction of the track, we need to look out for shooting the track itself. So let's look at some ways to avoid that. First of all, if we're on a crab dolly, we're tracking directly on the floor, in which case the track is not a problem. Secondly, if we're shooting widescreen or scope, it's easier to get the track outside the frame because our aspect is more horizontal. But regardless of aspect, it's surprisingly effective to only lay just enough track. Here we'll end the track where we are now, and then pull the dolly back to just before we see the track. Our wide push will then be between these two marks. Another way to avoid shooting the track is to put the camera on a jib and lay the track to the side. Now we don't have any problems and we can get very far back without getting the track in the shot. A very effective use for the master push is to slowly track into a scene as the action envelops the camera. Here we'll track into a hectic office as the red man and the women have dialogue. For the master push camera to not be isolated, we'll start by deciding on a useful place to end up. In this case, an over the shoulder. Here we'll do a lot of things at once to create movement. In the beginning, we'll walk with two extras into the office. As they walk to the left, the blue man walks across the room to the male extra. At the end, we'll have the red man mirror the intended over the shoulder to get even more movement. Since most of the movement is arbitrary, we'll just do whatever's easy. In the beginning, we tilt up on the extras to avoid shooting the track. The off-camera characters can take their cue from the dolly position. The red man is facing away and would need to take his cue from the dialogue, which can be worked out in a couple of rehearsals. From here on out, we would just continue with regular coverage. Tracking slowly into a scene as the action happens around us gives us a unique vantage point as if we're witnessing the event from a higher plane. Here we're pushing slowly as police officers fill the frame from left and right during a raid. But the most elegant move comes from again treating panning and tracking as completely separate moves. Here we're doing one continuous push into the scene. Then pan with the red man over to the blue man. Pan with him over to the desk. Swish to the red man, and ending in an over the shoulder. This move is surprisingly easy to do because all we have to do is pan with the action while pushing. That allows us to give stage direction that's based on character motivation and simply follow. As the framing becomes tighter, we have to coordinate their movement more, especially for the ending. The close push is one of the most useful and expressive moves we can do, and there are good reasons to use it in most scenes. It's tempting to do slow pushes as often as possible because of the production value, but it's when we stick to motivated pushes that we bring out the story. Most people choose when to push intuitively, but we'll try to put words to that by suggesting that close pushes are for meaningful moments. Most of what goes on in a scene is of course not a meaningful moment. Here the red man is talking about something that has no meaning at all, maybe the pizza he had for lunch. But let's do a close push anyway. As he talks about the double cheese crust and the extra layer of pepperoni, the push assigns meaning to the situation, even if there isn't any. But a close push is extremely powerful when we intend to show that something has meaning. As we push in on the man, we know that whatever's happening has special meaning, something is important or significant, or that something is going on, even if we don't know what it is. This by itself is a great use for the close push because it creates questions and participation, and it tells us we need to pay extra attention. But there are many other reasons to do a close push, and in this chapter we want to create a list of meanings and moments to look for in the script as motivations. This list is not meant as a rule book, but as a guide to find reasons for pushing. We'll look at 11 meaningful moments, which are focus, tension, significance, consequence, opening up, taking in, trying to understand, realizing, trying to decide, resolve, and anticipation. As with all other lists we've made, none of these exist in a vacuum and often overlap or combine. Focus is the most generic form of pushing. As we slowly push in, the attention is elevated, both for the characters and for us, and our senses are sharpened. Almost regardless of what a scene is about, focus increases our alertness. So if we're after a push and we don't exactly know why, we're probably after focus. Focus works well for situations that demand focus of the characters. Here the man is a submarine captain in the middle of a dangerous strategic battle. Tension is similar to focus in that it involves heightened awareness. Here the characters are trying to shut down a leaking nuclear reactor. As we cut between 4 simultaneous pushes, we're compressing the space between us and the characters, and we feel the pressure they're under. Tension works for any situation where there's emotional or mental struggle. Here the woman is struggling with conflicted emotions about a relationship. As we compress the space, we again create the feeling of pressure. Significance shows that something has a great deal of meaning. Here the woman is giving a speech about something that means a lot to her. As she talks about how many children are suffering from a certain disease and how easily we can help them, we feel how important this is to her. From a more technical blocking perspective, significance simply tells us that something is an important bit of information. Here the man leaves and we push in on a document he's forgotten, and since we're pushing, it must be significant. Consequence is about the seriousness of a situation or the potential far-reaching impact something will have. Here the couple are being informed by their banker that they have lost their entire life savings. We push in slowly as the gravity of the situation begins to dawn upon them and they begin to see how the world looks now. Here the president informs his cabinet that the only remaining option is to go to war. Obviously, such a situation is serious and has far-reaching consequences. With or without characters, consequence underlines the potential impact that something can have. Here we push in on a missile that's rigged to explode by timer. Consequence doesn't have to be negative. Here the character watches children of different races and religions play and sees the possibility of peace. On an equally philosophical level, we push in as the characters are watching a monumental event. Here the consequence is how this will change the world forever. Opening up is when a character opens up emotionally or mentally. Here the man begins to open up about his deeper feelings. As he makes himself vulnerable, we push in slowly. Opening up works for any situation where the characters become more sincere and really begin to connect with each other, becoming more sensitive and open. On a more mental level, opening up works for situations where characters begin revealing important information. Here the blue man is being interrogated. As he suddenly begins revealing the information they've been after, we push in slowly. Either way, opening up is about thoughts and feelings coming out from the character. Taking in is about thoughts and feelings going into the character. Here the woman leaves, and we push in on the man as he takes in the conversation. This is a typical reaction shot. Here the woman is a senator who learns that she's lost the election. We push in as she accepts defeat. Taking in again works for any situation where a character is feeling. Here the man is in a hospital waiting room as the doctor informs him that his wife isn't likely to survive. The last 5 motivations are really steps in the decision-making process. Starting with trying to understand, a detective investigating a murder is trying to piece together a complex case. On an emotional level, trying to understand is about trying to find meaning and sense in a situation. Returning to the man in the hospital, his wife might have been run down by a drunk driver. We push in as he tries to understand what the meaning is. Also, when a character is nostalgically remembering the past, what she's really trying to do is make sense of it. So as the woman is thinking back, trying to understand the meaning of past events, we push in slowly. Again, trying to understand is excellent for reaction shots. Here the man has been behaving oddly. When he walks out, we push in on her as she stands puzzled. Trying to understand also works when a character is trying to find out if something has meaning. Here the man hears his colleague say something that rings a bell. He walks over to get more information. Where trying to understand is about trying to find meaning, realizing is the moment of breakthrough. Here the detective is given a casual bit of information which happens to be the last piece he needs to solve the puzzle. Here the woman is telling the red man what his friends are saying behind his back. He suddenly sees everything in light of this new meaning. Here the women say something to the man and leave. We push in. As he turns, suddenly realizing the true meaning of what they said. Separate from the characters, we might be the ones realizing. In the same shot as before, the man rushes out. We suddenly hand off and push in on an important document he's forgotten. We might also be realizing something about a character. In the story, the man in the suit has been cruel, but as he forecloses his friend's house and takes joy in it, we realize just how mean he is. Trying to decide is when a character has all the facts and needs to make a choice. Here we push in as the man tries to decide whether or not to quit his job and follow his dream. Here the submarine captain in a standoff with another ship is trying to decide whether or not to fire. Resolve is when a decision is made. The classic use for this is when a character rises to the occasion. Here the man talks about how he's going to stand up to the fat cats in Washington. The push shows his conviction. Here an army captain is preparing his soldiers for war. We push in as he motivates them, reminding them of the reason for the war and strengthening their resolve. Finally, anticipation is watching and waiting for what will happen next. Here the characters have launched a rocket to destroy an asteroid that's threatening the planet. Their senses are alert as they can do nothing but watch and wait. Here, the parents of a kidnapped child have decided to give the kidnappers the money and are waiting for answers on the exchange. At this point, nothing they do can change the outcome. From our perspective, anticipation is probably the most generic reason for pushing. If we think about it, almost all pushes create this feeling of wondering what will happen next, and it's this alertness of the immediate future that draws us in. So the next thing we need to look at is how the track angle affects the push. A track that is angled directly on the character brings a sense of clarity. But even for direct pushes, it's best to angle the track slightly to get parallax, or the move feels like a zoom. Depending on the meaning of the push, angling the track either makes the world more unrestful or it makes the characters more confused. As the engineers try to shut down the reactor, the situation is now both more unrestful and confusing. As the detective has a realization, a direct push makes the realization appear clear. But as we angle the track, the detective has a much more vivid eruption of thoughts, becoming clear at the end. Regardless of the meaning of the push, angled track shows increased mental or emotional activity. As we push in on the man opening up, the angled track amplifies the drama. The most extreme angled push is to have the character turn in the opposite direction of the camera, which makes the background seem to rush by twice as fast. Here the detective realizes that the killer must be nearby. We get an enormous twisting effect and an extreme realization. But another useful way to look at angled track in close pushes is to see it as changing our distance to the eye line, which will make the shot more or less personal during the move. So as we're pushing in with the track pretty much directly angled on him, we're essentially moving along the eye line, and the move is personal throughout. But if we angle the track, we're gradually moving closer and closer to the eye line, which makes the move more and more personal, which very effectively emphasizes the push. The extreme of this is to track in from the side. Here we're pushing in from the left and move very hard towards the eye line, making the shot radically more personal at the end. But we could actually go even further and track around from the back. So here, the move becomes drastically more personal as we make it around to the front. Becoming less personal during a move is considerably less useful, but let's quickly look at it. Here we're starting out personal, but as we move closer, we become less personal. This has more the effect of keeping our distance, as if there's an invisible barrier we can't move closer than. A better use for this is to reveal other characters, which we'll look at a little later. So the last thing we'll look at is a technical consideration when shooting pushes. Very often, we're using a camera for the push that's already set up for a certain shot size, here and over the shoulder. But the problem is that as soon as we push that camera into a close shot, we no longer have an over the shoulder. Unless we're completely sure of not only the timing, but also which shot sizes we need when, we have to shoot 3 versions. First, we shoot a full take that remains an over the shoulder. Repositioning the dolly for a new take, we shoot a lock close-up. Finally, we shoot a take where we do the push at the right time. With these 3 options, we don't paint ourselves into a corner, and we can always cut wide again, or close again. When we're pushing in on a character, we need to look out for what happens if we're not at eye level. As we push in normally, the shot is balanced from start to finish. But while we're in the over the shoulder, it's not as clear what our level is. So lowering the camera, the level seems fine. But as we push in, we suddenly have to tilt upwards to keep her in the frame, which can look unpleasant if we get close. Back in the over the shoulder, we'll go up to what is still an acceptable level. As we push in, we now have to tilt downwards, which can get a little unusual. A practical use for being below the character is that his eye line goes out over us. As we push in, he appears to be dreaming or visualizing, which can be very effective. When we start to get a lot lower, the beginning of the push seems normal, but at the end of the push, the character can become extremely imposing. This is usually not what we want for a character. But for scenes that are supposed to be impressive, this works very well. As we push in on the palace, the closer we get, the more we have to tilt up. Towards the end, this causes us to look hard up on both the palace and the robots, and is great for establishing shots that need to be imposing. With an angled low push, it's worth noticing that we get both vertical and horizontal parallax. An angled track at eye level causes horizontal movement in the background, especially at the end. And a directly angled low push causes vertical movement in the background. When we both angle the track and lower the camera, we get both at the same time, which makes for a very dynamic move. When we need to push in on objects, it works well to come in at a higher elevation and simply pan and tilt to keep the object in the frame. Here we're pushing in on a tape recorder. Our height doesn't change, only pan tilt. Especially towards the end, we get heavy vertical parallax and a bit of horizontal. When objects are on the floor, we either have to be on a crab dolly or a crane so we don't shoot the track. As we push in, the height stays the same and we're still only panning and tilting. A lot of the moves we've already done involve some form of pulling, for instance starting on and revealing or opening and closing space. Additionally, we can naturally pull ahead of a character as he moves through a location. The only thing to note about this is that it's very hard to do on a track because people actually walk quite fast and the track would soon be revealed. So if we want to pull ahead of someone, Steadicam or crab dolly is the better choice unless of course we shoot at an angle. In this chapter, we'll simply look at two motivations for pulling that can be less obvious. The first is detaching. In this scene, we're with a man in the hospital as his wife has died. At this point, he's terribly alone and no one can help him or comfort him. So detaching from him is the most impactful way to show the sudden emptiness in his life. In this scene, the woman was supposed to meet an old love at a train station. The meeting had been arranged for many years, but he never shows up. As we detach from her, we again show the emptiness and aloneness in her life as she becomes smaller and smaller in the frame. If relevant to the story, we could turn this meeting upside down by pulling to in fact open the space for him to step in. Detaching almost always results in aloneness or emptiness, unless we're at the end of a story, at which point we'll be naturally detaching from the characters. At the end of this last scene, we've enjoyed a couple of hours in the company of the characters, they got each other, and we're now letting go. The second reason for pulling is relaxing, which serves to release the pressure created by pushing. This move doesn't have a lot of everyday uses, but can be very effective at the right point in a story. Returning to the leaking nuclear reactor scenario, we're pushing in on the characters as the tension peaks. The problem is unfixable and the plant is about to explode. Until suddenly the problem fixes itself. We pull out from the engineer as he looks over his panels, puzzled. All meters are suddenly returning to normal and the danger is averted. Next we'll look at two basic moves that we really should have looked at earlier, but have placed here because they lead us into the next chapters. Converging is the action of opposing characters' movement by moving closer to them as they move closer to us, which effectively doubles the perceived speed. As the characters rush in, looking for someone, both the characters and the story converge to create a crucial moment. The primary thing converging does is create extra tension. As the man rolls from terminal to terminal, we oppose his move, making the situation appear twice as hectic. There are really only two ways to create a converge. Here the character was already moving, and we decided to oppose that movement. The other way is to move the character when we're already moving. Here we're already doing a push for whatever reason the story provides. But to create more tension and emphasize the push, let's have the character step forwards at the same time. This compressing feeling is useful anytime we want a moment to have a higher level of focus and concentration. Here the woman will step closer to the man to say something very important. As she does, we tighten the shot by opposing her movement and thereby sharpen the attention. Converging is a very general action, and all we're after is the overall feeling of everything compressing into a single point, so a converge doesn't necessarily need to be head-on. Here the blue man walks to the terminal. We're not necessarily pushing in directly, but the general direction still gives us the same feeling. This makes converging an extremely useful move that can be applied to a host of situations. Here we're doing an angled or diagonal converge where both us and the character approach each other at an angle. This is useful for any situation where we already want to track to another part of the set. By angling the track inwards, we simultaneously get the converging feeling. Or as in this shot, where we already want to track with the character to the side to isolate him. By angling the track inwards and his move outwards, we simultaneously get the feeling of converging, which enhances our original choice to single him out. This kind of converging is effective for any scene that needs a higher level of action. Here an army sergeant rushes out with important new information needed for a critical mission. We could of course just track with him to where he needs to go, but we've deliberately angled both his walk and the track to compress the attention and make the situation more crucial. A different kind of converge that lends itself very well to long and calm tracking in a scene is a right angle converge. With this converge, we track at a right angle into the path of walking characters. This kind of move can go on for a long time, and the effect is that the framing starts out slightly off-key, and then slowly becomes clearer and more focused as we approach a clean angle, which makes the dialogue become more focused at this point. Doing the same move at a different angle with both characters and track, a right angle converge makes it very easy to get subtle and relaxed parallax in the foreground. If we were tracking on the side of the characters, any foreground would pass through the shot very fast. But here we're almost tracking in parallel, which means that we're not traveling very far compared to the distance the characters are traveling, so the foreground moves much slower. Again, as we approach a clean angle on the character's path, the shot becomes clearer and clearer. So it can be a good idea to time a right angle converge to end in a motivated stop for the characters. Like converging, countering doubles the apparent speed of a move, but where with converging the goal is to meet up with the characters in a single point, countering is opposing their movement from the side. The result is again the perception that everything is moving much faster, so anytime a scene needs more action, it makes sense to lean towards countering moves. Here the man walks in to find that something is wrong. By countering, we again bring more action to the scene. Here the blue man becomes displeased with the red man. By countering as he walks over, we add intensity to whatever is already happening. Additionally, since countering moves opposite the character, it's very effective for getting the maximum use of a small location. As here, where the man walks in and we move to keep the widest possible shot. As the man walks in, we start in this part of the room. The countering again adds more action, but the main purpose is to create more space. So as we end up over here, we're still getting a wide shot, which makes the room appear more spacious. Pivoting with track is a move that shares a number of technical similarities with pivoting and editing, which is why it has the same name. In pivoting, we would create overlapping groups by placing cameras that each have a particular character visible in both shots, preferably in the same part of the frame, which would smooth out the cut and create spatial continuity. Pivoting on track can do the same by replacing those two lock cameras with one on a track, and actually tracking between the two positions. The effect is that we keep the man locked in the same part of the frame during the move while the background is being replaced. But while the end result in this case is the same as with pivot editing, this is where the similarities end, because pivoting with track is such an essential move that it deserves to stand on its own. The key distinction in pivoting is that we're locking onto something as we move and keep it fixed in the frame. This is an effective way to reveal something, which we'll look at in the next chapter. But in this chapter, we'll look at using it to follow a second character while pivoting around the first. As the woman walks, we pivot on the man to keep her in the frame. We're essentially countering around the man, and the result is that we keep both characters in the frame almost no matter where the woman moves, as long as the man is stationary. So a pivot is really able to cover an entire scene between two characters, and it can be useful to base the whole coverage on one pivoting camera as a backbone, and then add locked reverses to fill in at each stop. So let's create 3 stops for the woman, starting at the door, then in front of the man, then over here, and add 2 locked reverses. As the woman walks from the door into the scene, we then pivot around the man. And as she comes to a stop, we cut to the first lock reverse. Back in the pivot, the woman walks to her second mark, and we keep countering around the man until she arrives, and we cut to the other locked reverse. As the scene goes on, we've covered almost 180 degrees of movement. The pivot camera works throughout the scene, and the 2 easy locked reverses fill in the coverage. So this is one useful move. The range of movement a pivot can cover is actually even wider. Here the woman walks to stand in front of the man, which is the same as we just did. As she walks in and out of the depth of the shot, we of course don't need to move. But we do again as she moves over here. So the woman can in fact move around the whole area in the top of the screen, which makes basing an entire scene on a pivot as a backbone very flexible. But pivots are also great problem solvers on a much smaller scale if we add pivots to tracks that are already laid in order to cover extra character movement. Here we track with the man between 2 keyframes. As the man now walks to the table, we reuse the track to cover him with a pivot. And back again. This can be done almost as soon as we have a track in the scene and regardless of how it's laid. As we arrive by the red woman, the move would ordinarily have ended here. But because the man needs to walk to the table, we simply tack on a pivot. This move can be easily added to most tracks and often be put in at the last minute because the track is already there. An even simpler version of this that does need to be planned is to pivot what would otherwise have been a locked reverse. Here we'll put this locked reverse on a track and pivot as the red man leaves. He stops on the way out, which the pivot covers easily, and as he leaves we pivot around to the front of the blue man. Putting the locked reverse on a track is naturally better than doing 2 separate shots because we only have 1 shot to do. So as the camera has now been locked throughout the scene, we pivot with the red man as he leaves, stopping here. When he leaves completely, we use the remaining track to pivot around to the front of the blue man, which creates the same kind of reaction shot feeling that a close push would. If we set this up differently, we could of course capture both a reaction and the other character leaving. Here we're again in half of a reverse pair, although this camera is on a track. As the red man leaves, we pivot around to the front of the blue man, getting both a reaction and covering the red man leaving. Since pivoting is so close to converging and countering, most of the same logic applies. Here we want the woman's entry to be more hectic, and as we oppose her movement, we're really doing a converge pivot counter, and it's hard to tell which one because they're so similar. What makes a move a pivot is simply that we lock onto something and counter around it. But to extend this idea, we can really lock onto anything we want. So let's pivot around the woman instead. As the man walks, she's now the fix. So for these bits of movement, the scene revolves around her. A converge also easily turns into a pivot if the track is angled. A straight converge by itself compresses the attention of the scene. But if we angle the track, the move becomes a pivot converge. As we converge, we're now moving more to the right as the woman moves more to the left, keeping the man fixed in the right side of the frame. Angling the track like this adds even more to the energy of the converge because the passing background creates unrest. Needless to say, we don't have to be pivoting around people. If a character's moving, we can pick a foreground object to pivot around. Here we've picked an arbitrary foreground object. We can just leave it at that, but we might as well pick an object that has significance in the scene later on. In this scene, we're really just countering on the man as he walks to the woman, but by starting on the pumpkin, which is a completely arbitrary object, the first half of the move becomes a pivot. Because these moves are so similar, it's extremely easy to go from one to the other. Even with the red man not visible yet, it's still a pivot, which then becomes a counter. Combinations like these can be quite elegant. Another interesting way to pivot around objects is to pivot around a gap in the foreground. Here we counter the man's movement by pivoting around the hole in the wall. If he walks back, we simply pivot in the opposite direction. The other half of pivoting is its ability to reveal, which is a move that's so effective it can be used in most scenes. Here we're opening a scene on a man as he's contemplating something. As we share in his experience and reflect with him, we do a calm and slow track, angled just enough to get a bit of movement in the background. But while it seems like we're only doing the move to create this feeling, the more important purpose is to end here and bring the woman into the scene. So this is again an extremely useful move, considering how many scenes start on one character and bring in another. Here we're doing a similar move, but from the other side. Again, the slow tracking creates a reflective mood, and it's fine to let a move like this go on for even half a minute because it gives us a moment to think and feel. In this scene, we've timed the other character's arrival to coincide with the end of the move. But it works just as well if we do it faster. Here we're essentially doing it as a start on reveal, but it still gives us a moment to identify with the man before the woman steps in. Surprisingly many scenes can be opened this way. To do an even faster one, we start on the woman, then quickly pivot reveal the others. But beyond that, with the track already laid, we might as well use the same track to pull back into the scene as the new character walks in. Here we're ending up by pivot revealing the woman. As she starts walking closer, we then continue pivoting to bring her into the scene. Altogether, this can easily give us a whole minute of coverage from just one camera that never gets boring. Pivot revealing isn't limited to the beginning of a scene. Here we're doing the first half of the scene in reverse dialogue between the man and the woman. But halfway through, we pull this camera over here to pivot reveal another character entering. From a blocking perspective, this comes about automatically if we simply connect the over-the-shoulder keyframe with one frame like this. And again, if the woman leaves, we might as well reuse the track to pivot the blue man the rest of the way into the scene. Over to the woman's mark, which means that the locked reverse still works. Again, in this shot, we're coming from a close-up, which is part of a previous dialogue. We pivot reveal the red woman as she enters, timed to the end of her walk. Here the man is being interrogated, and as we slowly pivot reveal, we constantly know that there's something outside the frame that's important. At the end, we reveal the panel of inquiry, and in the meanwhile we've covered half a page in a single shot. Pivot reveals work especially well when a reveal is supposed to be scary or surprising. If we think he's alone, suddenly pivot revealing the murderer can be very unsettling. Also, in many fantasy or science fiction stories, characters appear out of nowhere. Pivot revealing is a very effective way to cover this without a single visual effect. Here we just seem to be pushing in. To both the man's surprise and ours, the woman has appeared in the background. And again, we might as well pivot back to Walker into the scene. Finally, covering a walking character in a regular pivot can cause other characters to be revealed simply by the fact that he walks over to them. So as we cover the man's walk normally, the other characters are forced in and out of the frame based on his interest in them. As he walks to the red woman, she's again brought in by default. As soon as he's no longer focused on her, she's out of the shot. Tracking around is not about using circular track as one would think, but about tracking slowly from one side of a character to the other. Here we're covering a whole scene in one long shot that starts by pushing in on the woman. Halfway through the shot, we'll accelerate the pan over to the man and stay on him for the rest of the dialogue. What this does is create movement out of a scene that would otherwise be standing still, and it's a very economical way to cover a scene that has lots of production value. Since we're tracking from one over the shoulder to another, moving the dolly back here for a lock take allows us to continue cutting dialogue, and this may be enough coverage for some scenes. Tracking around allows us to do some unusually long takes that stay interesting and give subtle movement to the dialogue. In this scene in a cafe, the man begins to open up about his deeper feelings. Starting in and over the shoulder, the man begins opening up, and we slowly begin tracking around to his front, simultaneously both regrouping and pushing in. Doing a long move allows us to avoid cutting, which works well for a sensitive scene. And even if the move is a minute long, it never gets dull. If the scene continues after the push, we find ourselves without the previous over the shoulder. So we'll again move back for a locked version of the starting position. Here we're again doing a slow track to bring subtle movement to a scene, in this case a long and slow line cross. It's sometimes much more elegant to cover a scene in a single slow-moving camera than it is to put in tons of cameras. But unless the move covers the entire scene, it's best to make sure the camera ends somewhere useful, so the camera can be part of the subsequent coverage. The previous moves were done mostly for the sake of luxury, but tracking around becomes a more practical need when a character turns his attention from side to side. As he shifts his attention to a panel on the other side, we'll move over on the other side as well. Finally, tracking around can work very well as a counter to cover character movement. Here the two blue characters are a young couple, and the man in the suit, the girl's father, is trying to end their relationship. As the girl walks over to stand by the boy, we counter her movement, effectively tracking around. In keeping with having focus be one of the last decisions we make before shooting, let's now go back over the last two volumes and pick some shots to make focus decisions for. Obviously, the vast majority of moves only require follow focus, as here where we converge at an angle as the blue man steps forwards. The only difference between this and the locked follow focus from volume 1 and 2 is that there are more elements that need to hit their marks exactly. So let's pick some moves that specifically have action on several planes and require racking focus. In this shot from the chapter on tracking between deep staging shots, we'll start with focus on the foreground layer. As the man in the suit enters the room, racking focus to him very effectively emphasizes the attention shift that's already happening. After that, we simply follow focus as he walks over. When he walks out, we nudge focus over on the blue man. until we reveal the woman in the background and rack focus to her. Again, as she walks over, we follow focus. For this shot from opening and closing space, we start with focus on the blue man, and then rack focus on the red man as he steps up into the shot, and keep it on him until the red woman steps in slightly further back. In this shot from the chapter on pivoting, this camera's been the over-the-shoulder on the red man throughout the scene, so naturally focus is on him. As we pivot or converge on his way out, we'll keep the focus on him, and then rack focus out to the blue man for reaction. In this shot from pivot reveal, we're naturally keeping focus on the foreground character for the first part of the move, and then rack to the woman as she enters. For this scene, where we were deciding who to stay on during a move, the camera starts out as a locked over the shoulder, so focus is on the woman. As we move to the other keyframe, we're following focus because we're moving closer. And towards the end, we rack focus to the man since we're again in over the shoulder. When he walks back, we likewise follow focus on him. And at the end, rack focus to the woman because we're once more in over the shoulder. In this shot, the woman is walking into her apartment and will ultimately reveal the man up front. As he slides into the frame, we rack focus out on him, and back to the woman as the shot becomes irregular over the shoulder. In this shot, from panning from keyframe to keyframe, we're again dealing with a regular deep staging shot towards the end. As the man walks, we're simply following focus, which can be a little tricky because his change in depth isn't linear. Nearing the end, we'll lean the focus towards the red woman since she's the new character in the shot. And as the blue woman in the background turns her attention, we're naturally racking focus to her, which brings a lot more attention to her than if we had a wider depth of field. By the same token, in this shot from blocking transitions, the woman sits down and will again use focus to bring in a character deeper into the scene. As she turns to the man, we rack focus to him. Finally here, from pan start on reveal, we're following focus with the man, and end up racking focus to the woman in the foreground when she suddenly becomes the most important character in the shot. As we now begin to look at boom and crane moves, we'll spend this first chapter looking at some essentials of craning. The primary reason for doing crane moves is the obvious production value, and the ability to do these soaring and majestic shots that give us an elevated feeling, as if we're watching the story from a higher plane. The main difference between a boom or a jib and a crane is again really just the length of the arm, so we'll go back and forth between them at random and collectively call them cranes. Cranes are usually mounted on a track or some form of transportation, and by moving the base while booming, we can vastly increase the range of motion. This can create some impressive shots, even with very small cranes. Here we're using a simple jib. By tracking and using the boom to essentially only control elevation, we're covering an enormous range of motion. The end result is a move that creates a sweep that is very close to what a 100-foot crane would produce, except there's of course a limit to how high we can go. This is an effective way to get a lot of production value from even very basic equipment. It's also possible to move the base of a very large crane, which can create a staggering range of motion. But a note of caution is that large cranes are extremely heavy, especially if camera operators are sitting on a platform at the end of the crane balanced with counterweights. Just swinging the boom can sometimes take several people, and if we're moving the base at the same time, it can be hard to do precise movements like ending in very specific places. So moving the base of large cranes works better for moves where we intend to cut in and out of the middle of the move. A certain type of crane called a telescopic crane allows total freedom of movement because the length of the boom itself can be changed on the fly. This is great if we need more precision, or if we want to do dolly shots in places where we can't lay track. However, these types of cranes can be both expensive and noisy, and we're able to produce the vast majority of shots without them, so we won't cover them here. But of course the most normal move is booming with the crane standing still. An inherent issue with cranes is that the motion is circular and not straight, which means that if we keep booming in a direction, the crane will ultimately begin to move backwards. The first part of the move seems fairly straight. But as we reach the top of the circle, we gradually begin to move backwards. So we usually want to avoid the parts of a move where the circular motion is most apparent. In the beginning, the move is fine, but as we make it towards the top, we're suddenly moving backwards, which produces a strange experience. This artifact looks a little bit better when we're moving forwards, because it creates the feeling of pushing while craning. But it still brings attention to the equipment itself. Again, as we swing the arm to the side, the first part of the move seems straight. But as we get over on the side, we're now moving backwards. The morale is that it's better to get a longer crane and avoid using the extreme positions because the motion in these areas is usually undesirable. Two things are essential to do to really get the effect of a crane move. The first is to be sure to get as many moving perspective lines as possible. Here we're craning down on an empty scene, and without objects to create clear perspective lines, we get almost nothing from the move. But if we do the same move with crates in the shot, we have tons of moving perspective lines at different elevations, which makes the change of height much clearer. We get the maximum effect by swinging sideways as well as up and down, which makes the perspective lines move both right to left as well as down to up, creating a much more vivid perspective change. This is an extremely useful distinction that many forget. It's also useful to notice that the better choice for focal length is usually a wide-angle lens because we get to see more perspective lines, which are what give us the feeling of motion. With a long lens, we get to see many fewer perspective lines. The perspective of the shot seems much flatter, and the move could in bad cases be mistaken for a pan. The best reason for using long focal lengths on a crane is that we get much faster parallax from passing foreground and can also do more sudden surprise reveals at the end of a move. Secondly, as with tracking shots, it's of course crucial to either utilize the foreground already there or to deliberately put something in there for parallax. Here the branches are fake, but we've placed the crane so we would move behind the water tower. Everything else we looked at in the chapters on foreground applies equally well to crane, only on a much larger scale. Here we're doing a partially obscured move as we listen to the walking characters, which creates the same type of elegant shot and makes the characters blend better into the environment. As with pivoting on track, as soon as we've locked on a foreground object or a character, the parallax comes from the background instead. On a track, we would have to pan harder and harder to keep the subjects in the frame. On a crane, we instead have to tilt harder and harder, causing the maximum amount of parallax at the end of the move. This hard cranking at the end can effectively be used for revealing. But another way to look at vertical back parallax is as vertical unrest. Like regular unrest, vertical unrest again shows increased mental activity as if something is moving in his world and usually takes the form of a realization. In order to find out what the direction of the craning means, whether upwards or downwards, we can take our cue from the discussion on placement of the horizon line. When we placed the horizon line above the eyes, the woman appeared submersed or suppressed. When we placed it lower than the eyes, she appeared freer and more in command. So applying that to the crane move, as we crane up, the man has a realization. But the gradual upward movement of the horizon line creates the feeling that he's being submerged in thoughts, as if his world is becoming more confusing. If we crane down, the downward movement of the horizon line causes less and less clutter around his head, which gives his realization more clarity. We can of course mix both horizontal and vertical unrest, creating some very dynamic shots. Here we're again submersing the man, but the added horizontal unrest makes the situation more hectic. Maximizing back parallax is another good reason to use a long focal length on a crane. This produces much more extreme movement in the background, and the compressed space also makes the shot more disorienting. Meanwhile, the foreground changes very little, which creates an interesting mix of calm and action. This works great for aerials, too. Many of the techniques we'll look at in these chapters on craning mirror concepts we've already looked at, such as pivoting or start on revealing, only we're using them vertically instead of horizontally. Here we might have done a close push on a track. Using the same logic with a crane, we can do a vertical push instead. Whatever the motivation was for doing the push, we're simply turning it on its side, which creates great production value and can be the right move at the right time. Here we're opening and closing space, except with a crane. As the characters pass by, we're instead moving up to get the camera out of the way, creating an unusual move that might also be the right move at the right time. Additionally, a great way to integrate big crane moves into regular coverage is to treat the crane as a dolly for part of the move. Here we're starting out craning down, but as we get closer to the characters, we continue booming ahead of them, having adjusted their path to be slightly circular to follow the boom action. A use for being on a crane that's less obvious is to simply use a crane to place locked cameras in places that would be hard to get to otherwise. Here we want to shoot straight down on the knocked out character, which is easier to do with a crane. But since we're on a crane, we might as well do a slow vertical push and roll the camera as well. With the addition of the trees, we get parallax on our way down as well, which creates a very dynamic shot. In order to achieve a straight downward path, we have to pull back the base of the crane slightly to compensate for the circular motion. In the beginning, we're pulling back faster, then slower as the boom's arc straightens out. This is obviously great for creating shots where there's literally nothing under the camera. Here the blue man is threatening to jump from the water tower, and we want to crane out over the edge to create a dizzying feeling of height. These types of moves work best if we plan the shot so we're shooting almost directly downwards before we go over the edge, because it's the sliding out over the edge that makes us want to hang on to something. Cranes are also a great and simple aid in getting the camera very low. Here we're basically doing a dolly shot, but we've put it on a crane to get the camera lower. This could of course be done with the mount directly on the dolly, but it can sometimes be easier to do on a small jib, especially if we already have one lined up. Before we get started on building a small crane language, the most basic language is that of expanding or narrowing perspective, which means that if we're craning up, we're increasing our overview and taking in more of the scene. And if we're craning down, we're going from a wide overview to singling out something of importance. This creates a very powerful change of scale from the small to the large or vice versa. As we've moved with the characters, they walk towards the farmhouse and we crane up, expanding our perspective to a much higher level of the story. So where before we were focused on just two characters, we're now focused on the much larger world around them. By the same token, craning down narrows the perspective from the large and objective to the small and personal. Here we're craning down over a busy scenario, and we will end by focusing on just a few characters. It's common in writing to tell a story on several levels, both a personal story for one character, a group story for several characters, and an objective story that includes everybody. Using a crane to expand or narrow the perspective is very effective for changing story levels within a single shot. A common mistake is to plan too much coverage for scenes that have big crane moves in them. As we're doing a long move like this, it would be very sad to have to cut away. It's much better to simply decide to cover this entire part of the scene in a crane move alone so we get to see the whole thing, and then have the continuing coverage take over when the move is done. By adding crane to the logic of thinking in keyframes, we have a way to create some very elegant camera moves that are completely integrated into the blocking and come by almost automatically. All we have to do is pick keyframes at any height and angle and then connect them indiscriminately. In this scene, the woman will start here and then move over here. So to set up two keyframes, we'll start with one here with the blue man slightly in the background, and a lower one over here is a stagger deep staging shot. Combining the keyframes on a track, the change in height is very minute, so chances are we can simply shoot this with a dolly and go lower for the second keyframe using the hydraulic arm. Starting on the blue characters, the woman walks, and we easily end up in the second lower keyframe. As usual with keyframes, the blocking is continuously tight, and we get an elegant change in height as an automatic byproduct. The great thing about this approach is that we can block without any care about camera height. Here we're doing a deep handoff from the blue man to the red woman, and from above, the camera plot looks virtually the same as if both characters were standing. But as a consequence of one character sitting, we get a classy move where we boom down as we hand off to the woman. By the same token, craning between keyframes is effective for covering character movement, as here where we pull into an over-the-shoulder, and crane down as he sits down. This could easily be done with tilting or with more cameras, but craning just has more production value. If we simply pick the keyframes we need to be in, connecting them with a crane and track is very straightforward. A less obvious use for craning is as a substitute for shots we would traditionally do with tilting or separate cameras like inserts. Here we have one shot on the woman, and we want an insert on the computer screen, which would work fine as separate shots. But starting back on the woman will instead crane down, which creates a very elegant perspective change, although maybe a lot of panning towards the end. In this scene from shifting, we would start on the man, and then shift down on the gun, which could just as easily be done as an insert. Again, replacing that with booming will instead boom down, creating pronounced parallax from the foreground and a very expensive-looking shot. Finally here, the men will shake hands on a business deal that troubles the woman. So we want to do an insert on them shaking hands while we keep the woman in the background. These keyframes again easily combine in a one shot that pushes in while booming down, ending here. On a larger scale, it's useful to have crane moves end in an actual keyframe instead of just craning down arbitrarily and cutting close to another set of cameras. Here we're covering an entire scene in one long move. For the first part, the foreground is heavily obscured and the characters are far enough away that we can only hear them. Ending in a keyframe gives purpose to the move, but a thing to look out for is that while a wide-angle lens works best for the upper part of the move, it may be too wide for dialogue. Craning directly up or down into dialogue is also an excellent way to get into a scene. Here we're craning directly down as the characters are trying to locate the source of a strange sound. In addition to functioning as a vertical push, the move is disorienting in the beginning because we can't see the location, which is revealed by the heavy back parallax towards the end. Again, ending ready for dialogue. Here we're craning up into a keyframe but on a smaller scale, and again the move functions as a vertical push. When we're pushing vertically, we're essentially moving closer and closer to the eye line, which makes the move seem more and more personal towards the end. Changing topics and moving on to craning in parallel, this works the same as tracking in parallel. Here we would match the characters' horizontal positions wherever they moved, and moving closer to or further away from the camera had no bearing on the move. Craning in parallel works the same, except we're mainly matching their vertical position. As we play this reference scene fast, the fact that the characters are moving in and out doesn't result in any need to boom. Only when their vertical position changes do we need to boom down. This is extremely useful for covering characters walking through a large location with several levels. In one grand sweeping move, we're able to capture a wide range of motion simply by placing the crane to the side and booming down softly as they change levels. Starting back at the top and playing at regular speed, we're using a long enough crane that we don't feel the circular motion. So we're really using the crane as a dolly, except we're changing height with the characters. However, this move could have been just as easily done with a smaller crane if we moved the base during the shot, which would create enormous production value at a very low cost. Using crane to start on and reveal is first of all useful for enhancing moves we might as well have done with panning or tilting. Here we're instead craning down from the store sign to reveal the characters, and we've of course made sure to get behind a tree and a lamppost to get parallax. We're also making sure to move both down and sideways to get parallax in both directions. Here we're craning up from the ground, past the grill of a large truck, and up to reveal the characters sitting in the compartment. This could easily have been done with a tilt, but the vertical parallax creates a much more impressive move. The problem with this shot, though, is that because we're shooting the truck head-on, we have very few leaning perspective lines, making the shot sort of flat. So in this version, we're doing a similar move from the side, this time also pushing the base as well to cover more ground. Here the foreground is much closer, creating a sense of disorientation, which cleans up as we get above the hood of the truck. Whether we use these moves just to make a scene opening more interesting or to deliberately withhold information, they can stay on screen far longer than simpler moves, as here where a man steps out of a car, puts out a cigarette, then begins walking. Of course, we're really starting to miss a walk cycle in the animation, but instead of putting this together out of separate shots, we get one long move that keeps delivering. Almost every other technique for starting on and revealing we've previously worked with applies equally well to crane. Here we're starting with the characters off camera, and as we hear them talk, we slowly crane into the scene. The move follows the same logic as it would have on a track, but on a much larger scale. Here we're moving out from behind an arbitrary foreground object to get parallax in the beginning, in this case a chandelier. As we follow the characters, the chandelier creates a great sense of movement. But towards the end, we could actually use some more foreground objects to get a better sense of movement. But it's really the parallax itself that's most effective for creating reveals with a crane, because the plane that's closest to the camera is the one that slides in and out of the frame the fastest. Here we crane down, and the background stays virtually the same. But the foreground changes much more dramatically, which makes it perfect for revealing characters or objects. Here we're again back with the truck, and as we crane down, the background changes very little. But the foreground almost slides in like a separate layer. This is one of the times where a longer focal length can be a better choice for a crane move, because as we single out a smaller part of the scene, the foreground also moves much faster and reveals more suddenly. If we'd done this with a regular lens, the reveal would be much more gradual and might not even have come across as a reveal, but just a crane down. By the same token, sliding obstructing foreground out of the frame to reveal the grander vista behind it also works great. Here the foreground layer is a hill. As we crane up, the background stays virtually the same, and we're sliding the foreground layer out the bottom to reveal it, spectacularly expanding the perspective. Moving on to converging, this again mirrors what we did with track, except we're converging vertically. Many of the types of crane moves we've already done automatically converge, as here where we crane down while the woman arrives. We're really converging at a right angle, but vertically. The reason we're looking at this in the same breath as start-on reveals is that it's very easy to do both at the same time. Here we start behind an unknown character. As she walks closer, we converge upwards, simultaneously revealing the character. We might also simply start a move behind an arbitrary foreground object to get parallax, and again converge up as the character steps closer. Since people are usually standing on the ground, doing a clean reveal of a character is much easier when coming from above. Here we're converging down as the woman walks to someone. And towards the end of the move, the parallax causes the other character to be revealed. This is great on a larger scale as well, because we can bring in things when they're needed. Here a hijacked truck drives towards us. At just the right moment, the fence enters the frame, and the truck crashes through it. Pivoting on crane again follows the same logic as pivoting on track, except vertically. But where pivoting on track is for keeping one character static as the other one moves side to side, pivoting on crane is for reframing as a character steps closer. As the woman steps closer, we keep the man locked vertically and adjust for the woman's movement. Set up like this, the move is a tiny nudge and can easily be accomplished on a dolly. We could of course just tilt up, but that would force one of the characters to be slightly oddly framed. As the woman walks back, we pivot upwards again. This is an extremely useful move because when characters who are not at the same level get closer to each other, we need to change the vertical angle quite a bit to keep them both in the frame. Here the woman walks closer, and we pivot hard to maintain the framing. We could just see it as a vertical reframe, but it's technically a pivot because the move rotates around one of the characters. This, of course, mixes very well with horizontal pivoting. Here the blue man is a doctor, and for his walk to the patient we'll set the first stop by the desk, and the second stop here. For this, we'll need to do both horizontal and vertical pivoting, so as the doctor walks over, we pivot sideways to capture that axis of his move, and downwards to continuously reframe vertically. The shot then starts out as a deep staging shot. As the doctor walks, we're really just moving between two arbitrarily placed keyframes, but the result is a pivot on two axes. On a larger scale, this is useful when characters' angle of motion changes. Here we're pivoting around a fictitious point at the top of the hill, so as he moves upwards we get a straight angle on that. And as his path levels out, we get a straight angle on that. There's really no telling if this move is a pivot, a reframe, or a converge. We're pivoting on a virtual point at the top, causing the shot to continuously reframe to get the best possible angle, but the downward movement also causes us to meet up with him at the top. This is additionally where we get the heaviest reveal of the background, because the angle suddenly and quickly levels out. Again, as when we were on a track, pivoting creates the entire parallax from the background, which makes it excellent for revealing, and this is the same on a crane. Here we're starting on the patient, and as we crane down even just a little bit, we get almost 45 degrees of movement in the background, which is enough for a complete reveal. This is the same if we're coming from below. Even just a slightly different angle causes an almost complete replacement of the background. And we again end by revealing the doctor. This is naturally useful for bringing characters in. Here we're over the shoulder on the man as he's reading a document. The red woman is entering off camera, and we pivot down to bring her in. If we had tried to do something similar with a tilt, at least one of the characters would have ended up with an extremely odd framing. Pivot revealing with crane makes it very easy to reveal objects or characters at different altitudes because it's simply a matter of which height we start and end the move at. Here the woman is trying to escape a colony of overgrown bugs. As she rushes into a room to find safety, we seem to just be craning down, until we reveal a giant bug sitting on the ceiling. In this final short chapter, let's look at changing our elevation while we push in. This is first of all effective for pushing in on objects that are only visible from above. As we push in and elevate, we're creating a great deal of mystery at the beginning, and not revealing what we're pushing in on until the end. Here we're pushing in on a piano that has suddenly begun playing by itself. As we're coming in from below, we really can't see what's going on, which again creates a sense of mystery. As we elevate, we get better and better access, and our curiosity is more and more satisfied. When we crane up while pushing in on a character, the effect is that we're moving closer and closer to the eye line, which allows us to get deeper and deeper insight into his thoughts and feelings. When we're craning down while pushing in, we get more and more of whatever the effect is of shooting upwards. This usually makes a character seem more imposing, which then increases as we push in and down. But an interesting thing about shooting characters from below is that even if their eyeline is level, it goes out over us and can make it seem like they're looking upwards. In the right situation, the same push can therefore be used to make the characters seem more and more dwarfed as they look up on something much bigger. If we know that the characters aren't looking up on something, pushing in and going below the eyeline can instead make a character appear dreamy or imaginative.